Hi, and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to show you a Pennsylvania Railroad station I've been working on. It's a combination weigh scale and agent office, and it's called a scale agency office. This one happened to be located in Weigh Scale, Pennsylvania. Now, a good friend of mine has a large Pennsylvania Railroad layout, and this is in O scale, and he has the location of weigh scale represented on his layout. Now, he had built a placeholder for the scale agency office and asked me if I could scratch build one. I told him I'd give it a try. Now, he had gotten together some grant line windows and doors for the project, but I realized the windows were so unique looking on this building that to really represent it accurately, I wanted to have laser cut windows that mimicked it. So I went to my friend at Railscale Models and had him laser cut windows that were exact replicas of the building. So with these laser cut windows, my siding, my strip wood, and my shingles in place, I got ready to start on the project. And those photos at the beginning you saw are all I had to go by. Now, coming up for a color of the building was difficult because some of the photos were black and white, and the color ones, none of them matched. Plus the building was pretty dark in most of the photos. So we came up with a combination of stains and colors that we thought would represent Pennsylvania Railroad buildings pretty well. Before cutting any siding, I took all of my window templates and placed them in a design that I had made showing all of the walls in their correct dimensions. And then I printed those out on paper and glued them onto poster board. This way I was able to make my own mock-up using the actual scale windows and doors and make sure everything looked accurate. Now, I was using O-scale scribe siding for this, and I started laying out my templates on the scribe siding, and I started cutting it out. I used a combination of a couple different cutting devices to cut this out. And then once I had all of my wall pieces, I taped it together just to see how it was going to look in comparison to my mock-up. I had gotten a square die punch. I was going to try punching out the corners of the windows and then connecting those, but it didn't work very well. It damaged the wood more than anything. So after cutting my strip wood, I laid my template on the siding and started marking where the windows were going to go. And once I had all of the corners marked, then it was an easy matter of just lining up all of the corners with a pencil, and that was where I was going to be cutting. So I started cutting out my windows. These were a couple of the attempts with the square die. Then once I had my window and door openings in the small building done, I test fit my windows and doors. Then I moved on to the large building and started cutting the windows and doors out of that as well. And it took a while, but once I got all of my windows and doors cut out of the large building, I taped it together again to check it. Then I designed templates for the floor and the roof of the bay windows. And after attaching those to some wood, I went ahead and cut those out. And then I started putting the bays together. And I used strip wood and just basically built up framing for it, making sure everything was square and true while I was putting these together. That was going to be very important. Then I test fit them onto the side of the building where they were going to go to make sure they would fit. Then I started adding more framing to the bay windows, making sure they were nice and rigid. I put them in place then against the front wall and marked where I was going to cut out the wall material. Then after cutting out the wall material, I put the two bay windows in place to make sure they would match up. Then I started adding some more of the stuff that was going to have to go on the bay windows, such as the siding, and the windows and window frames would have to come later. And at this point I started gluing my walls together. I first started with the small addition that was on the end of the main building. I made sure all my corners were nice and true at 90 degrees, and that all my joints were nice and strong. And once I finished the small addition, I moved on to the main building. Besides the exterior walls on this, there were a few interior walls as well. And I had to make sure that everything was nice and tight and was lining up at perfect 90-degree angles. And it took a couple days assembling this building, but I wanted to make sure all my glue joints were nice and tight and everything was straight. Then once I was done gluing everything together, I put them all together, including the bay windows that I had added the siding onto, just to see how they would look. And at this point, I cut some flooring to go in the bottom of the building, and I added some bracing to go across the top to help keep everything straight and true. Because next up was going to come the staining and painting. I first put on a coat of Hunterline creosote black. Then I also used Hunterline stains inside. I used sepia brown on the flooring and driftwood on the walls. Then over the creosote, I used a very thin version of Vallejo buff. And after I put that on and it dried, I went over with another coating of creosote black. And this gave us the kind of dirty, somewhat buff color that we figured most of the pictures were representing. I also put the flooring and stained it inside the main building. Then I used the same process on it, starting off with the creosote over the wall. And then after letting it completely dry, I came back and used a wet palette for putting my Vallejo buff on. Now I used Liquitex acrylic thinner to thin out my Vallejo paint. And it allows it to go on smoother, but it still has a transparent look to it, so the creosote was showing through from underneath. And you can see what the second layer of creosote does over top of it with this comparison with the small addition to the main building. So I then went back and put my creosote over the entire building. Then I went around the base of the building with some Vitero murky brown, just to make it a little more weathered. Now it was time to start working on all of the trim on the bay windows. So after looking at what I actually had to accomplish, I started cutting some of my pieces of strip wood, and I used quite a variety of different sizes to put in place, and I had to use my Ultimation sander and slicer in order to get all these angles correct. But using those tools made it very easy to get all of my trim cut and in place. Then I had to make the frames for the windows that were going to hold them in place. And again, that took a lot more cutting of different sizes of wood. But then I started putting all of the window frame pieces together, and they had to be centered and perfectly upright. But once I had all those pieces in place, I only had to add a little more trim around the roof of each one. And then I was able to paint the siding on them the same as the siding on the main building. Now I started working on the window exterior trim. First I cut all of the trim out of their carrier sheets. And then I went through all of them, sanding off all of the little nubs where they were cut away. Then using masking tape, I taped them to a sheet, took them over to my spray booth, and sprayed them all a burnt umber color. That's the color that all of the dark paint was going to be on this building. So once they were dry, I tested one, seeing if using a little bit of gray, sponging it on, made it look like the paint was starting to peel. And it had a pretty good weathered effect to it. So I used this technique on all of the windows. And then after they were all dry, I started going over them lightly with a sanding stick, just to make it look like the paint was starting to peel off a little bit and worn in some places. And it took a while, but I got through all of the windows for this. Now there was one more piece of trim that the bay windows needed before I was done with them, and that was where the corners come together. It had some vertical trim. So I had to cut some very small pieces, glue them in place, and then I painted all of the trim on the bays, again using the burnt umber color. Next came the window frames. We had selected a craft paint in Tuscan red for this color. So again, using upside down masking tape, I taped them all in place, and then just used the sponge method for applying all of my paint to these frames. They end up coming out too bright, just as they are, but once I go over them, again using a Hunterline creosote color, it tones them down and makes them look very accurate for a shade of Pennsylvania red. So then I cut all of the windows apart and started putting them together. These are the 4 different window types that we had. Now after I glued the frames together, I had to start gluing the acetate into these windows. And this took a lot of time. Each piece of acetate had to be cut separately, and especially for ones where I had windows that were open, I had to cut them to a special size. Then I started using some HO 1x2 as my window frame holders. I glued them in place in the opening, and then the window was able to be set behind this piece, and that set it back just enough that it looked like it was a window frame in a wall. But I had to go through all of my window openings and put this very small strip of wood in each one. Starting on the doors, the one door with the transom over it, the photos indicated that it was flat on top, but the Grantline door had a peak, so I used my sander to remove that. Then, before painting my doors, I primed them, then I airbrushed them with the same burnt umber. Then after that color was dry, I came back and used the same sponging techniques with the gray paint that I had used on the window trim, and it gave the look of paint that had started to age and peel. Then I also painted the panels inside some of the doors. The photos indicated that they were lighter there. We assumed it was the same buff color. And this is what the doors and windows look like in the small addition. At that point, I glued all of my doors in place into the main building. Then I started gluing the windows and the window trim onto the small addition, just to see how this would go. And I used canopy glue for all of this process. The next step, I started applying corner trim to the building. First I painted some scale 1x6 with the burnt umber. And then once it was dry, I again used the sponge technique with gray paint to make it look like it was aging. Then after cutting, I glued them in place again with canopy glue. And this is what the corner trim comes out looking like. And I now started working on some window shades to go inside. I cut some pieces of buff stock and then used pan pastel to make them look dirty, especially around the bottom edge where hands would be gripping them. So at this point I had all of my windows and doors glued into the building, and I was starting to put on the window shades. And this is where we're going to stop for part 1. Once I'm done with the building, I'll put up part 2 and show you how it finally came out. I appreciate you watching.